Every building that went up in New York City between the 1960s and the 1990s has a secret embedded in its foundation. Not a design flaw, not a structural problem. A tax. 2% of every construction contract worth between $2 million and $15 million. Paid not to the city, not to any government. To 5 men who sat around a table and divided New York's skyline between them like a pie. The buildings are still standing. The tax receipts exist nowhere. And the family that collected the largest share of all of it never poured a single yard of concrete themselves. They just controlled who did. This is the story of the Gambino crime family, the most powerful criminal organization in American history at its peak, and the construction empire that made them untouchable. Picture this moment first. December 16th, 1985. 5:16 p.m. East 46th Street, Midtown Manhattan, 9 days before Christmas. Thousands of shoppers crowd the sidewalks. Horns blare. The city moves at its usual impossible speed. A black Lincoln pulls up in front of Sparks Steakhouse. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, the most powerful man in American organized crime, steps out of the passenger side. He is shot 6 times in the head before he reaches the sidewalk. His underboss, Thomas Bellotti, exits the driver's side a second later. He is shot 4 times. He dies in the street. 2 blocks away, in a car with tinted windows, John Gotti watches his boss die. Then he drives slowly past the bodies to confirm the job is done, and turns south toward Brooklyn. The most powerful criminal organization in America has just been decapitated, in public, on one of the busiest streets in the world. And John Gotti, the man who ordered it, will go on to hold press conferences on his street corner and appear on the cover of Time magazine. He will destroy in 8 years what took 3 bosses 50 years to build. But to understand what was lost the night Paul Castellano died on the sidewalk outside Sparks, we have to go back to a stowaway on a ship from Sicily, and the quiet, patient man who built the machine. He didn't arrive like a conqueror. He arrived like everything else that came through the port of Norfolk, Virginia in December of 1921. Quietly, without fanfare, through a side door. Carlo Gambino was 19 years old, born in Palermo to a family with generational mafia ties. He had grown up understanding the rules that governed life in the shadows. Loyalty, silence, patience. Before he understood much else, he came to America as a stowaway on the SS Vincenzo Florio. He made his way to New York City and moved in with cousins. He found work at a small trucking firm. He kept his head down. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall. Slight frame, permanent friendly grin. He looked like a harmless grocer. Behind that grin was a mind that would outmaneuver every man around him for 50 years without ever spending more than 22 months in prison. He joined the Mangano family in the 1930s, worked his way up, never rushed, never overreached. When Vincent Mangano disappeared in 1951, murdered most believed by his own underboss Albert Anastasia, Gambino adjusted without complaint. He became Anastasia's underboss. He watched. He waited. He was learning something that most men in his world never understood. The man who needs to be loudest in the room is never the most powerful man in the room. Albert Anastasia had a problem that would eventually kill him. He could not control himself. The co-founder of Murder Inc., the most feared enforcement arm in American organized crime history, Anastasia had built his reputation on violence so extreme and so indiscriminate that even his allies were afraid of him. He ordered the murder of a Brooklyn man named Arnold Schuster, simply because Schuster had helped police capture a bank robber Anastasia admired. Schuster had nothing to do with organized crime. He was a civilian. The commission was outraged. Killing civilians drew attention nobody could afford. Anastasia was selling memberships into his family, charging thousands of dollars to anyone who wanted to be made, undermining the entire concept of the organization's exclusivity. He had tried to muscle into Meyer Lansky's Cuban gambling operations without permission. Lansky, a man whose goodwill was worth more than any casino, threw his support elsewhere. By 1957, Anastasia had alienated almost everyone who mattered. And the man who had been watching all of it from one step below, his underboss, Carlo Gambino, made a decision. The morning of October 25th, 1957, Anastasia arrived at his favorite barbershop on the ground floor of the Park Sheraton Hotel on 56th Street and 7th Avenue. He loved the feel of a hot towel on his face. He loved the ritual of a good shave. The barber wrapped the towel around his eyes. 2 gunmen walked in, scarves covering their faces. They shoved the barber aside. Anastasia heard them. He lunged from the chair, blind, disoriented. He hit only their reflections in the mirror. They kept firing until he was dead on the floor. New York woke up to headlines screaming of underworld carnage. Carlo Gambino attended the crime scene photos as evidence of his own promotion. He was the boss now, and unlike every man who had come before him, he intended to stay that way. Here is what made Carlo Gambino different from every boss before him. He never wanted to be famous. He wanted to be rich. He wanted to be powerful. He wanted to be untouchable. Fame was the enemy of all three. While other bosses held court in restaurants and nightclubs, Gambino held meetings in his modest brick house in Massapequa, Long Island. While others dressed in expensive suits and drove flashy cars, he wore plain clothes and moved without ostentation. The FBI pursued him for decades. They indicted him in 1970 for masterminding a major East Coast burglary ring. Legal wrangling delayed the case for years. His doctors claimed his heart condition made him too frail to withstand trial. Deportation proceedings were initiated when authorities discovered he had entered the country as a stowaway and never become a citizen. His doctors said he was too weak to travel to Italy. The proceedings dragged on. He was never convicted of another crime after his 1937 tax evasion charge. While this was happening, while the government spent years trying to build a case against him, Gambino was quietly building the most sophisticated criminal empire in American history. His method was simple: identify the choke points, not the products moving through the economy, the infrastructure that moved them. Unions, trucks, concrete, the invisible machinery that made every business in New York function. Control the infrastructure, and you tax everything that moves through it without touching any of it directly. The construction industry was the crown jewel. Here is a fact that requires a moment to absorb. Teamsters Local 282 represented approximately 4,500 construction truck drivers in New York City and Long Island. Their job, deliver concrete and building materials to construction sites. Without Local 282 drivers, concrete doesn't pour, materials don't arrive, buildings don't go up. Every construction project in New York City ran through these men. And the Gambino family controlled Local 282, not as silent investors. The union's leadership answered to men who answered to Gambino. The union president from 1976 to 1984, a man named John Cody, was later convicted for illegally loaning $2 million in pension funds to Chicago mobsters. Government investigations confirmed the pivotal role Local 282's leadership played in the criminal ecosystem connecting the Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese families. When Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss, who eventually became the most significant mob informant in American history, turned state's evidence in 1992, he described Local 282's role in language that left no ambiguity. He called it the linchpin. With control of Local 282, the Gambino family had a single switch. Pull it, and construction across New York City stops. Concrete hardens in trucks, foundations wait incomplete, deadlines blow past, penalties accumulate, contractors bleed money by the hour. That switch was never pulled. It didn't need to be. Everyone who mattered knew it existed. The union was the mechanism. The concrete club was the revenue. Here is how it worked with a precision that would be admirable in any other context. The commission, the governing body of all five families, chaired effectively by Gambino after Vito Genovese's imprisonment in 1959, designated a small group of approved contractors to handle all construction contracts in New York City worth between $2 million and $15 million. Not through bidding, not through competition, through designation. If your company was not on the approved list, you did not get those contracts. Not because you were legally excluded. Because when you tried to compete, your materials didn't arrive. Your workers had union problems. Your project manager had accidents. The approved contractors paid 2% of every contract value directly to the commission. 2% sounds modest. On a $15 million contract, that is $300,000 for a single job. Paul Castellano, Gambino's cousin and eventual successor, ran the family's concrete club interests with the precision of a corporate executive. His son, Philip, was president of Scaramix Concrete Corporation, which exercised a near monopoly on concrete supply in Staten Island. A recorded conversation, obtained legally by federal investigators, captured Castellano discussing his union control. His exact words: "Well, you know, as far as I'm concerned, we got control of both revenue streams." A man who had inherited a butcher shop from his father talking about controlling the bones of an entire city. The Jacob Javits Convention Center, one of New York's most recognizable public buildings, funded by taxpayer money, was overcharged $12 million for concrete because the Gambino-controlled cartel had priced every pore. $12 million of public money, embedded in the walls of a building that hosts trade shows and conventions. Every person who ever attended an event at the Javits Center paid for it. They just didn't know it. When Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack in his Long Island home on October 15, 1976, watching a Yankees game on television, he had never been convicted of a serious crime. He had arrived as a stowaway. He had left as the unofficial chairman of the board of the most powerful criminal organization in America. He had survived the Castellamarese War, survived Anastasia, survived 2 separate mafia coup attempts, survived decades of FBI investigation, survived deportation proceedings, survived everything. He died in his bed. His succession choice shocked everyone. The obvious candidate was his underboss Aniello Della Croce. Respected, experienced, beloved by the street-level men who had built the family's criminal operations for decades, the man who had earned it. Gambino passed over Della Croce entirely. He chose Paul Castellano, his cousin, his brother-in-law. A man who had spent his career managing construction interests and meat distribution rather than street operations. A man who thought of himself, and this is not exaggeration, as a legitimate businessman. Gambino's reasoning was clear to anyone who understood what the family had become. The construction empire, the union control, the commission relationships, these required a businessman to manage them, not a street boss. Della Croce's men were furious. They felt the succession had been inherited rather than earned. But Della Croce himself, then in prison for tax evasion, kept his men in line. He accepted the underboss position under the new boss. The family held, for now. Paul Castellano expanded everything Gambino had built. He purchased a mansion in the prominent Tot Hill neighborhood of Staten Island, a columned White House so large and so visible that FBI agents called it the White House. He kept a domestic worker named Gloria Olarte as his housekeeper, then as his companion. His wife lived in the same house. He was not subtle, but his business instincts were extraordinary. He took the construction empire and deepened it, his son's concrete company. The Teamsters Union Control, the Concrete Club, the 2% commission on every designated contract. He ran legitimate businesses that made millions. A wholesale poultry company at its peak, supplying 300 butchers across the city, 2 major supermarket chains under his influence. He had connections that extended, according to law enforcement, as far as Kuwait. Sammy Gravano, who worked under him and later helped destroy him, said of Castellano, "I thought he was the best thing since sliced bread. He was intelligent, extremely sophisticated, astute, business-wise, perceptive, creative, ingenious, and resourceful. But Castellano had an instinct that would eventually get him killed. He wanted legitimacy more than he wanted loyalty. He banned drug dealing across the entire family. The rationale was sound. Drug charges brought longer sentences, which made men more likely to cooperate with prosecutors. Castellano had seen the math clearly. What he hadn't calculated was that his most ambitious captain, a Queens-based street boss named John Gotti, was already dealing heroin through his crew and had no intention of stopping. And the FBI already had the tapes to prove it. In August 1983, 2 members of Gotti's crew, Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti, were arrested for heroin distribution. The arrest was based primarily on recordings from a listening device planted in Ruggiero's house. Castellano found out. He demanded the transcripts. He wanted to know exactly what had been said, who had been mentioned, what the tapes revealed about his family's operations. Gotti's crew refused to hand them over because they knew what was on them, and they knew that if Castellano heard it, the consequences would be fatal. The standoff created a fault line that ran through the entire organization. Della Croce, Gotti's mentor, tried to shield his protege while keeping Castellano's anger manageable. He stalled, he delayed, he bought time. On March 30th, 1984, federal agents indicted Castellano on racketeering charges, construction fraud, extortion, drug trafficking, murder. He was released on $2 million in bail. The FBI had installed listening devices in the walls of his Staten Island mansion while he was on vacation in Florida. They had drugged his watchdogs, disabled his security system, and spent months recording conversations in his dining room and living room. The White House had been compromised. Then, on December 2nd, 1985, Della Croce died of cancer. The last buffer between Castellano and Gotti's crew was gone. Castellano did not attend the wake. He cited legal concerns. He needed to stay out of public view. Gotti, who had been loyal to Della Croce above all else, took the absence as a declaration of disrespect, as evidence that Castellano saw himself as above the men who had built everything he was now trying to protect with lawyers and bail money. The decision had already been made. 14 days after Della Croce died, on a cold December evening, 9 days before Christmas, Paul Castellano arrived at Sparks Steakhouse for a meeting. He had no idea what was waiting for him outside. The moment Castellano died on the sidewalk, John Gotti became the boss of the Gambino family. He did not hide. He held court on his street corner in Ozone Park, Queens. He held 4th of July fireworks displays in his neighborhood. He attended charity events. He gave interviews. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine under the headline, "The Mob's New Godfather." He was called the Dapper Don. He wore $1,000 suits and had his hair blow-dried on his way to court appearances. Federal prosecutors took him to trial 3 times. 3 times, witnesses changed their testimony. 3 times, juries acquitted. He was nicknamed the Teflon Don. Nothing stuck. He was exactly the opposite of everything Carlo Gambino had built the family to be. Gambino's entire operating philosophy was invisibility. The machine ran because nobody could see it clearly enough to dismantle it. Castellano, for all his vanity, at least understood that the mansion and the suits were a private performance, not a public one. Gotti turned the entire family into a spectacle, and in doing so, he handed the FBI exactly what they needed: a face, a name, a story the American public was already following. In 1990, the FBI arrested Gotti on racketeering charges. In 1992, Sammy Gravano, Gotti's own underboss, decided that cooperating with the government was preferable to dying for a boss he no longer believed in. Gravano testified against Gotti in extraordinary detail: the murders, the meetings, the conspiracy to kill Castellano, the entire internal architecture of the most powerful criminal organization in America, described in a federal courtroom by the man who had helped run it. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on 13 counts, including the murder of Paul Castellano. He was sentenced to life in federal prison. He died of throat cancer on June 10, 2002. He had been in prison for 10 years. The head of the FBI's New York office made a statement after the conviction. He said, "The Don is covered with Velcro, and every charge stuck." The Gotti conviction didn't just send one man to prison, it sent dozens. The indictments that followed dismantled the construction empire that Carlo Gambino had spent decades building. The concrete club was broken. The commission's 2% tax on New York's construction industry was exposed in federal court in granular detail. Contractors who had operated under the cartel's umbrella for decades faced prosecution. The Jacob Javits Convention Center overcharge, the local 282 pension fund frauds, the union presidencies bought and sold. All of it documented, all of it prosecuted. The family that had been called the most powerful criminal organization in America was, within a decade of Gotti's arrest, a shadow of its peak. But here is the number that tells the full story. In 2008, 17 years after Gotti's arrest, 22 years after Castellano's murder, the New York Attorney General's office indicted Gambino family members and associates on construction industry charges. Extortion, racketeering, the same sites, the same methods, the same 2% structure, different names, identical machine. The construction empire that Carlo Gambino built never fully died. It just lost its most visible operators and found quieter ones. The Gambino family's construction empire lasted nearly 40 years at its peak. It was built by a stowaway from Palermo who arrived with nothing and spent 50 years accumulating more power than any criminal in American history, without ever drawing the kind of attention that killed the men around him. It was expanded by a butcher's son from Brooklyn who understood that the future of organized crime was in boardrooms and union halls, not back rooms and back alleys. It was destroyed by a man from Queens who confused celebrity with power. Carlo Gambino died in his bed watching baseball. Paul Castellano died on a midtown sidewalk outside a steakhouse. John Gotti died in a federal prison hospital. 3 bosses, 3 completely different endings, all of them produced by the same family, the same machine. The next time you walk past a building in this city, any building, consider this. If it went up between 1960 and 1990, somewhere in its foundation, in the concrete that holds it up, there is a 2% tax that was never declared, never reported, never refunded. It went to men whose names never appeared on any contract, And most people walking past those buildings every single day have no idea. But here's what nobody has fully explained yet. The family didn't just collect a tax on construction. They owned the concrete itself, the trucks that poured it, the unions that drove them, the companies that supplied it, the contracts that funded it. Every single layer of the construction process, from the quarry to the foundation, had a Gambino hand somewhere inside it. How they built that machine, how they hid it, and exactly how much it was worth. That is the next story.